Hi, my name is Capria, and I want to talk about a somewhat controversial topic, which is the social work license. So, just to preface this conversation, I am not talking about whether there should be a license, the disparities in kind of results for tests, or any of that. I will leave that to people who are much more informed about the current situation and can really speak to what they see as the current landscape of what's going on with regards to the licensing and disparities in the testing outcomes. So, with that being said, this video will really focus on the conversation around macro social workers and licensing. And when I talk about licensing in this video, I'm specifically talking about the highest license that social workers can receive, which is typically called a clinical license. Although I know the name varies slightly throughout the states, and I know different states have different numbers of licensing. So I am talking about the highest license, the clinical license in this conversation. So, um, essentially, as many of you may know already, there are different types of licensings for social workers, but the clinical or highest license usually is focused on demonstrating clinical skills, particularly working with individuals and families. And it's usually a series of different requirements that you have to do. So engaging in a clinical practicum or a clinical internship where you're applying clinical skills in a real world setting, receiving clinical supervision from a clinician who is trained to, who has skills in the clinical settings and can help guide you in building competency as a clinician. And then, of course, the test, which is typically focused on, again, testing your ability to apply clinical concepts, theories, as well as like broader social work concepts and theories, including in meso and macro spaces, but is primarily focused on really those clinical skills. And so there's been a lot of conversation over the years about whether this license or a social work license in general, but especially the clinical license, is relevant to those in the macro social work space. So while I have previously, years and years ago, said, no, I don't think so, now I would say it depends. And, I think I was misinformed in saying that you should not have a license because I did not see or really don't see the relevance to my roles. But what I can say is that I see that the license could be relevant depending on your interests, your background, what types of roles you're going for. And so, all of that to say that the decision to get a license should absolutely be informed by your career interests and where you would like to go. And so, I will speak to why I chose or have chosen not to pursue licensing, either master's or clinical level licensing, um, or just licensing in general. And I think the big part of that is that simply the jobs that I pursue or am interested in do not mention licensing as either a preferred or required qualification. And part of this is because many of these jobs are in settings that don't have a lot of social workers, don't aren't led by social workers, and there's not a lot of awareness of clinical or licenses in general. So they don't even know master's or clinical or what that even means. So you don't really see a lot of these jobs looking for people with those licensing because its applicability to the roles is hard to understand when you don't even really know what it is. I think the other piece to that too is I think for those of us in these settings, it can be hard to understand or even, kind of communicate for ourselves or especially for employers the relevance of some of these licensing. So like if I in a role as a data analyst, how do I demonstrate the relevancy of a social work clinical license as a data analyst? It's a little bit harder to do. But for some people, for someone, let's say, who is, leading an agency that employs clinical social workers, that person, it may be very advantageous to have a clinical license and or it may be required to even get the role. And so again, it will all depend on what your kind of goals, career interests are. Maybe you want to be a consultant for child welfare agencies around policy and practice and things like that. They might also see it as advantageous that you have a clinical license and can apply that lens to your consulting work. But again, it really does depend on what you're looking to do. If you're seeing that these roles are, requiring or preferring licensing, then I think you should definitely pursue that. I think for me, it has not been, again, I have not seen its relevance in my work, but I've seen other things, like, for example, the project management professional PMP certification. That's something I see mentioned a lot in roles that I am pursuing. I am a previous project manager. I still manage projects. And so the PMP allows me to demonstrate my competency as a leader of projects within my organization and demonstrate my knowledge, skills, and abilities in the project management space. So for me, the PMP certification seems to be a lot more advantageous to my career path and career interests. And that's why I am focusing on that. But again, this is based on my career interests, the strategy that I'm taking for my career, that as to why I'm pursuing that certification as opposed to a license. So those are my thoughts on licensing and certifications. And I'm really curious if those of you who do have this license and work in the macro social work space, if you have seen or felt that the license is, beneficial, advantageous to the roles that you're in, I'd love to hear that too, because I think it's important to get different perspectives.